Let me set the scene for you. Dean Winchester, 40 years old, hunts monsters for a living and lives in an underground World War II era bunker with his brother Sam and his best friend Castiel. Naturally, being a monster hunter, Dean has endured a lot of trauma over the course of his life, and that is why I believe that he has post-traumatic stress disorder according to my knowledge of mental disorders in the DSM-5. He displays many of the symptoms characteristic of post-traumatic stress disorder, and these include Criteria A, exposure to death, threatened death, serious injury, threatened serious injury, and threatened or actual sexual violence. Over the years, Mr. Winchester has been exposed to and endured many traumas. He has witnessed several deaths, including but not limited to his mother Mary, his brother Sam, his daughter Emma, and his surrogate son Jack, as well as his best friend Castiel. Circumstances also called for him to kill one of his closest friends via decapitation. His line of work frequently involves him being on the receiving end of violence and injuries of varying degrees, and he has endured torture in hell of an extensive duration. Additionally, he has died multiple times, one of them by his own hand, when he purposely overdosed on drugs. Criteria B, persistent re-experience of the traumatic event, which can include nightmares, flashbacks, emotional distress and physical reactions to traumatic reminders, and unwanted and upsetting memories. Mr. Winchester has been documented having nightmares about past trauma, as well as being emotionally distressed after exposure to reminders of his trauma. This was more prominent shortly after his return from hell, but continues to persist to this day. Criteria C, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli. Mr. Winchester does not like discussing his trauma and does his best to avoid emotions or thoughts related to his trauma, to the point of attempting to block it out entirely. He has referenced one of his strategies for managing his trauma being, and I quote, shoving it down and forgetting about it, which is a clear display of avoidance. Criteria D, negative thoughts or feelings that began or worsened after the trauma. This includes, but is not limited to, blaming oneself for causing the trauma, casting blame on others for causing the trauma, isolation, overly negative thoughts about oneself and one's world, and the inability to recall key features of the trauma. Mr. Winchester displays several of these symptoms, primarily self-blame and negative thoughts about himself, which have been persistent throughout his hunting career. Depending on the trauma, he may also have a difficult time recalling key features or remember the trauma in a way that enhances any negative involvement he may have had. One specific example of this occurred when Mr. Winchester was leaving Purgatory. He had spent the year prior searching for Castiel, then a way to return both himself and Castiel, as well as their companion, a vampire named Benny, to Earth. This ended with the discovery of a gateway to Earth. The process of traveling through the gateway was difficult, and in the process, Castiel deliberately separated himself from Dean and Benny, so they exited the gateway separately and in different places. This led Mr. Winchester to believe that Castiel was still stuck in Purgatory. The whole event was traumatizing to the point where Mr. Winchester rewrote his memories of the event in such a way to blame himself for what had happened. He also has difficulty remembering events that took place when he was between the ages of 17 and 27. This is likely due to both trauma from hunting and living in a high-stress situation, which disrupts the formation of short-term and therefore long-term memories. Criteria E relates to trauma-related activity, and Mr. Winchester meets the requirements for this section as well. He is frequently irritable and aggressive, and these symptoms only worsen and heighten in intensity as he endures more trauma. He rarely hesitates to engage in risky or destructive behavior, such as killing himself, agreeing to seal himself in a magic box with Archangel Michael for all eternity, and drinking heavily. Additionally, he suffers from hypervigilance accompanied by a heightened startle reaction and does not fall asleep easily or stay asleep for long. He uses alcohol as a way to get himself to sleep, and when he does sleep, he only needs, and I quote, 3 or 4 hours every couple nights. He also has difficulty experiencing positive emotions or affected times, particularly in the months following any of Castiel's deaths. His symptoms have lasted for longer than a month and created functional impairment when it comes to his social life and ability to exist normally in society, as evidenced by an attempt to leave hunting and live a normal life, which ended in disaster and the destruction of his only long-term romantic relationship. Romantic relationships are often an unfortunate casualty of those suffering from PTSD. His symptoms are also not due to medication or substance use. Mr. Winchester does use alcohol as a coping mechanism, and that has its own faults, but it is not the cause of the symptoms listed above. These presenting symptoms means that Dean Winchester qualifies for post-traumatic stress diagnosis. Yay! As for treatment options, I would recommend that Mr. Winchester engages in humanistic therapy, which champions the idea of discovering and living in our truth. More specifically, I would recommend that he uses existential therapy and logotherapy. Logotherapy is a form of humanistic therapy that focuses on finding one's purpose. I believe that Mr. Winchester would benefit from this because he has struggled with identifying a purpose for himself beyond hunting monsters, which is a purpose his father assigned to him and has been a source of anxiety and depression for him, as well as prevented him from moving past his occupation-related trauma, as he believes he is nothing without it. Logotherapy can enable Mr. Winchester to move past some of his trauma and begin to process it rather than live within it. Existential therapy promotes the ideas of free will and self-determination, which are both ideas that Mr. Winchester has struggled with in the past. One of the major sources of his trauma comes from not being in control of himself or able to make decisions. So I believe that existential therapy would help Mr. Winchester overcome that part of his trauma and aid in giving him the opportunity to live a more full life with better managed PTSD.